Yeah, Ann and David, a recent report published in the Detroit News has revealed that several major companies are helping to fund the governor's trips. At the same time, those companies have received billions of dollars in financial benefits from the state. It's raising concerns about a lack of transparency. Members of the House of Representatives Oversight Committee addressed the issue in a hearing today. The president of the Center for Economic Accountability, a government transparency nonprofit group, gave testimony to support many of the findings in the Detroit News article, plus some of his own research claiming those companies received kickbacks. He argued those deals only benefit the companies involved in the many economic development groups tied to the Michigan Economic Development Fund.
According to the best evidence that I can find publicly, 20 of the 29 foundation companies that are currently listed on the foundation's website as supporters have received subsidies, some form of subsidy deal from the state in recent years. Obviously, the intent is to, sort of get that access and to be able to have a voice on the topic of economic development, whether it is broad policy or whether it is a specific deal.
Also discussed during today's hearing, a failed economic development effort on the west side of the state. Officials say China-based tech company Goshen did not hold up its end of an agreement with the state of Michigan. The battery plant in Big Rapids would have been a $2.4 billion project. Back to you, David.
All right, Riley, thank you. As for the scrutiny over the governor's travel plans, News 10 has reached out to Governor Whitmer's office for a response to the legislative hearing. We have not heard back yet, but we will let you know when we do.